She had $1.40 left in the world, a dog she couldn't afford to feed, and a town full of strangers who didn't care which way her luck fell. Alara Whitlock had buried her husband, lost her farm, and traveled 300 miles on a wagon with a cracked axle. And now she was standing in front of a dog trader's post in Redstone Crossing, trying to talk herself into the cruelest thing she'd ever done. When she handed over Dusty's rope and walked away, the dog let out a sound that wasn't quite a bark. It was something worse than that, something that made the whole street go quiet. And one man, leaning against a post at the far end of the road, pushed himself upright and started walking toward the sound. If you want to find out whether Alara ever got that dog back, and what that quiet man's arrival would cost them both, stay with this story until the very end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The wagon rolled into Redstone Crossing on a Tuesday, which was the worst day to arrive anywhere. Markets were closed on Tuesdays. The blacksmith took his half day. The boarding house filled up Monday nights with traveling merchants who paid a week in advance and left their boots in the hallway. And by Tuesday morning, there wasn't a spare room to be had for another 6 days. Alara Whitlock didn't know any of this when she pulled the mule to a stop at the edge of the main road and looked out at what was supposed to be her fresh start. It wasn't much to look at. Redstone Crossing sat in a shallow valley between two ridges of rust-colored rock that gave the town its name, and the whole place had the worn, exhausted appearance of somewhere that had been promising to become something better for about 20 years and hadn't gotten around to it yet. The main street was dirt-packed so hard it had cracked in places like old clay. The storefronts were mostly false-fronted timber buildings, their painted signs faded to near nothing by the Wyoming sun. A water trough sat in front of the general store with a greenish film on the surface. 2 horses were tied to the hitching rail outside the saloon, even though it wasn't yet 9 in the morning. Dusty sat beside her on the wagon bench, his nose working overtime, cataloging every smell the town had to offer. He was a blue heeler, mostly. Some people thought there was some border collie in him too, but Alara had never bothered sorting that out. He was medium-sized and compact, with a gray speckled coat and one ear that stood straight up and one that flopped. He'd been a wedding gift, technically. Her husband Thomas had brought him home as a half-grown pup the spring after they married, claiming he'd won him in a card game, which Alara had never quite believed, but also never pressed. Thomas had been gone 14 months now. She didn't think about it in a straight line. It came at her sideways, the way grief tended to. In the smell of wet hay, in the particular angle of late afternoon light, in the way Dusty sometimes went and sat by the door at dusk and looked at it for a while before coming back to lie down. She clicked her tongue, and the mule moved forward, slow and unhappy, into Redstone Crossing. She had $1.40. She'd counted it 3 times since dawn because there was nothing else to do while the mule walked, and she'd been hoping somehow it would change. It hadn't. $1.40 was what was left after selling the wagon wheels. She'd traded them for a set that didn't wobble. And paying the ferryman at the Sweetwater Crossing and buying a 1/4 pound of dried beef at the last trading post, which she'd shared equally with Dusty because he'd been working harder than she had for the last week, keeping pace with the mule on foot since she didn't have room on the bench for both of them once her remaining boxes were loaded. The boarding house, she found out from a woman sweeping the steps of the dressmaker's shop, was full until next Monday. "There's a rooming house on the south end," the woman said, not unkindly. "Mrs. Pratt runs it. She's cheaper, but she don't allow animals." Alara looked down at Dusty, who was sitting on her foot. "Thank you," she said. She tried the hotel next, a 2-story building that called itself the Redstone Grand, though Grand was doing a lot of work in that sentence. The man at the desk had a carefully trimmed mustache and the look of someone who assessed people financially before he assessed them any other way. $4 a week, he said. In advance. No cooking in rooms, no animals. "I don't have $4, Alara said. He didn't look surprised. He also didn't look sorry. She walked back out into the street. The sun was getting mean now, the kind of late morning heat that bounced off the packed dirt and hit you from below as much as above. Dusty pressed against her leg. She put her hand on his head without thinking about it, the way she always did, and stood in the middle of the street feeling the full weight of where she'd arrived at. This was the plan. This was the destination she'd spent 3 weeks traveling toward, Redstone Crossing, where her cousin Martha's husband had worked until last year. where he'd written back saying there were jobs and land was still available and a person with some grit could make something of themselves. What he hadn't mentioned in his letter was that he'd moved on 6 months ago, taking Martha with him, to somewhere in Colorado. Alara had found that out from the postmaster at the last town. So the plan was gone. She had $1.40, a mule that wasn't hers. It belonged to a farmer in Laramie, and she'd borrowed it on the promise she'd send it back with anyone heading east, which she hadn't managed yet. And a dog that ate approximately as much as a small person. She stood there long enough that people started glancing at her as they passed. A woman alone, standing still in the middle of the street, with a healer at her side and a look on her face that was somewhere between exhausted and furious. People noticed that. They didn't stop, but they noticed. There was a sign she'd passed on the way in. She'd registered it without really reading it. Now she turned and walked back to look at it properly. Brackett's Livestock and Trade. Dogs, horses, mules. Working animals bought and sold. Fair prices paid. It was nailed to a post outside a low building at the edge of the commercial stretch, between a harness shop and what looked like a closed-down assay office. Through the side fence, she could see a pen with a few horses in it, and another smaller pen where 2 dogs were moving around. Alara stood there for a long moment. Dusty looked up at her. "Don't," she said, to herself more than to him. She walked away. She went to the general store and asked about work. The man behind the counter, heavy-set with flour dust on his apron, said he didn't need anyone and hadn't for 6 months. She tried the saloon, where the barkeep told her he didn't hire women without experience and that his one barmaid had been there 7 years and wasn't going anywhere. She tried the dressmakers, whose sign said "Help Wanted," but who told her apologetically that she'd filled the position just last week. At noon, she sat on a bench outside the general store and ate the last of her dried beef and split it with Dusty and tried to think. She could ask for work at the livery. She could try the outlying farms and ranches. Maybe someone needed a hand for the season. She could sleep in the wagon if she could find somewhere to put it that wasn't town property. She could write to her sister in Ohio, which would take 3 weeks each way, and her sister's husband had made it clear he didn't want anyone else's problems showing up at his door. She sat there until the beef was gone, and the thinking wasn't producing anything new. Then she stood up, and she walked back to Brackett's Livestock and Trade, and she tied Dusty's rope to a post outside, and she told him to sit and stay, and she went inside. The man behind the counter was maybe 55, with a sun-wrecked face and the slow, methodical movements of someone who'd worked with animals long enough that he'd absorbed some of their patience. His name, she'd find out, was Roy Brackett, though he didn't volunteer it. "What are you looking to do?" he asked. "Sell a dog," she said. She kept her voice flat. If she let any of it into her voice, it would come out wrong. "Blue heeler, 4 years old, good with cattle, very good with cattle. Knows maybe a dozen commands, not a biter unless you deserve it." Roy Brackett looked at her for a moment with eyes that had seen people in all kinds of bad spots and didn't judge them for it. "Let me see him," he said. She brought Dusty in. He was good about it, sat when she told him, came when she called, demonstrated his intelligence in that matter-of-fact way he had that made it seem like he was doing her a favor by bothering. Roy watched him with professional attention. $8, he said. It was fair. It might even have been a little generous. $8 would get her a room, meals, and enough time to find real work. "Okay," she said. She looked down at Dusty. He was looking up at her with that particular expression he got. Not worried exactly, but paying attention. He'd always been a dog that paid attention. Thomas had taught him to sit on a hand signal, just 2 fingers pointed down. She'd always thought that was showing off, but Thomas had been a little like that with things he was proud of. "Okay," she said again. She handed the rope to Roy Brackett, turned around, walked to the door. She got through the door. She got 4 steps down the boardwalk. She was going to keep walking. She had made the decision, and she was going to honor it. Dusty started howling, not barking. She could have managed barking. It was that high, broken, confused sound that dogs made when they genuinely didn't understand what was happening, like the world had shifted under his feet, and he was asking her to explain it. It rose and then broke and rose again, and it cut right through her like something physical. She stopped. She heard other people stopping too. The sound of foot traffic on the boardwalk went quiet. Somewhere across the street, a conversation paused mid-sentence. She stood there with her back to the door and her hand pressed flat against the timber wall and told herself to keep walking. She had no room. She had no money. She had no plan that included a 60-pound dog who ate like a wolf and needed work to stay sane. None of those facts had changed. The howling continued. "Ma'am!" She turned. The man standing in the middle of the street had clearly come from somewhere down the block and stopped when he heard the sound. He was taller than average, rangy rather than bulky, with the kind of build that came from actual labor and not any particular vanity about it. He wore a plain dark hat that had seen serious weather and a canvas work jacket with one pocket slightly torn. He looked maybe 32, 33. It was hard to tell with men who worked outside. His face wasn't handsome in a smooth way. It was the kind of face that had character, which meant the sun, and something else had both done their work on it. He wasn't looking at her with sympathy exactly, more like assessment. "Is that your dog?" he asked. "Not anymore," she said, and heard how that sounded. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the door she'd just come out of. Then he looked back at her. "What are you selling him for?" "Because I can't keep him." She said it bluntly, the way you had to say things when being blunt was the only way you could say them without falling apart. "I've got no room, and no money, and nowhere to put either of us. So." The man stood there. The howling was still going. "What's wrong with him?" he asked. "Nothing's wrong with him." A flash of heat in her voice that she hadn't meant to put there. "He's the best cattle dog I've ever worked with, and I grew up on a cattle farm in Nebraska. He's smart, and he's reliable, and he doesn't quit. There's absolutely nothing wrong with him." "Then why is he making that sound?" "Because he thinks I'm leaving him." She said it and then wished she hadn't, because saying it put the whole shape of it into the air where she had to look at it. The man was quiet for a moment. "How much did you take for him?" he asked. $8. He nodded slowly, as if that confirmed something he'd been calculating. Then he turned and went into Brackett's. Elara stood on the boardwalk and listened to the howling, which had settled into something lower and steadier and more devastating than the first outburst. She thought about walking away. She thought about it seriously. She'd made her decision and she'd acted on it, and now she was just extending the suffering of it by standing here. She didn't walk away. After maybe 3 minutes, the man came back out. He had Dusty's rope in his hand and Dusty at his side, and Dusty was still agitated but had stopped making noise because he was looking around with the focused attention of a dog trying to locate someone specific. He found her. His whole body changed. The tight-coiled anxiety released all at once, and he lunged forward, and the man let him go. And Dusty covered the distance between them in about 2 seconds and pressed himself against her legs with enough force that she had to take a step back. She put both hands on him. She could feel him shaking slightly, just the residual tremor of something he hadn't understood and hadn't liked. "I bought him back," the man said, which was not quite accurate. He'd bought him for the first time. She'd sold him, but she understood what he meant. She looked up at him. "Why?" she asked. "Because I need a cattle dog, and my reasons don't go much further than that right now." He pulled his hat brim slightly. "Talon Mercer. I run the Mercer Ranch about 4 miles south of here. I was in town for feed, and I wasn't planning on hiring anyone today, but I find I need a hand, and you seem to know the animal." She stared at him. "You're hiring me," she said. "I'm asking if you want work." "There's a difference." He said it without arrogance, more like someone who'd learned to be precise about the things he promised because he'd had imprecise promises made to him before. "I can offer room and meals and $3 a week. The dog stays with you. I won't ask you to do anything you're not willing to do. And if either of us decides it's not working after a month, no hard feelings either way." "I don't know you," she said. "No," he agreed. "You don't." I'm not going to a strange man's ranch without knowing more than your name." "That's sensible." He didn't seem bothered by it. "Ask me whatever you need to know." She looked at him carefully. He stood still for it, which she noted. Most people got uncomfortable under a direct look. He just stood there and let her look, like someone who figured he'd be found out sooner or later anyway, and preferred sooner. "Do you have a family?" she asked. "A wife?" "No." "Who else is at the ranch?" "My foreman, Pete Daly. He's been with me 6 years. There's a bunk hand named Cal who comes and goes, that's all." "What happened to your last hand?" Something moved across his face, not quite discomfort, but something adjacent to it. "Left in March." Better offer somewhere else. She wasn't sure she entirely believed that, but she didn't push it. I'll want my own room, she said, with a lock. There's a storeroom attached to the main house I've been meaning to clear out. I can have it done by the time we get back. I'll need advance on the first week's pay. For a few things. He reached into his jacket without any visible annoyance about it, pulled out a small fold of bills, and counted out $3. Handed them over. She took them. What's your name? He asked. What's your name? He asked. Elara Whitlock. He nodded, extended his hand. She shook it. A working handshake, firm on both sides, nobody trying to prove anything. Wagon at the edge of town is mine, she said. Or borrowed, technically. The mule, too. I need to find someone heading east who can return them. Pete makes a supply run to Cheyenne every few weeks. He can arrange it. That was that then. She looked down at Dusty, who was sitting on her foot again, which was his preferred resting position when he was unsure of circumstances. His ears were up, alert, reading the situation. All right, she said. Not to Talon Mercer exactly. Maybe to herself. Maybe to the last year of her life and the wreckage of what she'd come from and the strange, precarious shape of where she was apparently going. She collected her things from the wagon, 2 boxes, a canvas bag, and a bedroll, and loaded them into the back of Talon's truck wagon, which was heavier built than hers and had a team of 2 solid bays who looked well kept. She noted that. You could tell a lot about a person from how they treated their horses. They drove south out of Redstone Crossing in something that wasn't quite silence and wasn't quite conversation. The road ran through scrub and low grass and occasional clusters of cottonwood along a dry creek bed. The sky was enormous and slightly hazy with dust. After a while, Talon said, The ranch is about 400 acres. Most of it is grass range, some rough pasture. I run about 80 head right now, down from 120 last year. What happened to the others? Dry year, had to sell some early. Lost some to a waterhole that went bad. He paused. It's been a rough stretch. How long have you had it? Family ranch? My father built it. Another pause, shorter. He's been gone a few years. She didn't ask more about that. It had the quality of something that had a longer story behind it that he wasn't offering. What do you need most right now? She asked. He glanced at her. Meaning what? I mean with the operation. What's the pressing problem? He thought about that for a moment. Cash flow's tight. I've got cattle ready to sell, but the Denison broker's been dragging his feet on the contract price for 2 months. I've been waiting him out, but it's costing me. What's he offering versus what's fair? He's at 11 cents a pound. Market price out of Cheyenne is 13. Then stop waiting and go direct to Cheyenne. He looked at her again. It's a long drive. It's a longer wait at 11 cents. She said it plainly, not trying to be clever about it. I drove cattle to market 3 times with my husband. It's work, but it pays the difference. He didn't respond right away. She thought maybe she'd overstepped, offering opinions on the business when she'd been hired for the physical work, not the management of it. Thomas had always told her she had a habit of moving faster than people were ready for. But after a moment, Talon said, I'll think about that. The ranch appeared at the top of a low rise, a main house in weathered timber, a barn that was larger than the house and considerably better maintained, 2 smaller outbuildings, and a series of corrals running along the south side. There was a windmill that was turning slowly and a water tank that looked solid. The grass around the buildings was dry, but not dead. It had the look of a place that had been well built and was being maintained with care, but not much surplus. A man came out of his barn as they pulled up. Medium height, maybe 50, with a gray beard trimmed short, and the unhurried walk of someone whose joints had opinions about moving fast. Pete Daly. He looked at Elara without particular surprise, which told her Talon had hired outside help before, and Pete had stopped having expectations about it. Pete, this is Elara Whitlock, Talon said, climbing down from the wagon. She's going to be working with us. She knows cattle work. Her dog stays. Pete's eyes went to Dusty, who had jumped down and was already moving along the fence line with his nose down, establishing the territory in the thorough, systematic way that good working dogs did. That's a healer, Pete said. Yes, Elara said. We had a healer years back. His voice was neutral but not unfriendly. Good dogs if they've got something to do. He'll have something to do, she said. Pete looked at Talon in that way that longtime employees communicated entire conversations without words. Talon gave a slight nod that apparently settled whatever the question was. "I'll clear the storeroom," Pete said, and went to do it. The storeroom took an hour to clear. It was small, barely 12 by 10, with a single window facing east and a plank floor that had warped slightly in one corner. There was a cot frame that needed a new rope base, which Pete replaced with efficient indifference, and a washstand with a cracked basin that Alara decided she could work with. When Pete brought a mattress from somewhere and dropped it on the frame, it was serviceable. She put her 2 boxes in the corner and her canvas bag on the washstand and her bedroll at the foot of the cot. Dusty walked the perimeter of the room twice, sniffed the corners, and lay down in the strip of sunlight under the window with the resigned satisfaction of a dog that had had a long day. "Yeah," she said. "Me too." Out. She found her bearings over the following week in the way you did. Not all at once, but piece by piece, learning which fence sections were solid and which needed attention, where the cattle liked to cluster at midday, which of the 2 horses she'd been assigned had a habit of testing the bit on the left side. She learned that Pete Daly was a man of few words, but those words were generally accurate, that he'd been with Talon since before Talon's father died, and that he had a particular affection for the old gray mare in the second stall, who wasn't useful for much anymore but whom no one had suggested selling. She learned that Cal, the bunkhand, showed up Monday and Wednesday and occasional Saturdays, and that he was young, 19 or 20, and worked hard but thought slowly, which was a combination she could manage. She'd learned that Talon Mercer rose before dawn every day and came in last, and that he ate his meals quickly and without much ceremony, and that he was not a man given to small talk but was capable of direct conversation when the subject warranted it. She learned that he had a habit of reading in the evenings, actual books, which surprised her slightly, and that he was careful with money in a way that spoke of someone who'd had to be. And she watched the operation the way she'd been trained to by her father, who had believed that the first thing you did with any farm was understand it before you tried to change it. What she saw was a ranch that was being kept alive by competence and stubbornness, but was losing ground slowly on every financial front. The Dennison situation was exactly as Talon had described. The broker had been stringing him along on price for 2 months, knowing that cash-strapped ranchers eventually caved and took the lower number. She could see it in the accounts ledger, which Talon let her look at after the first week when he apparently decided she was going to be around long enough to make it worth explaining. "You let me see your books?" she said, when he set the ledger on the table. "I need someone who can do figures," he said. "Pete's good at most things. Arithmetic isn't one of them." She'd done the figures on her and Thomas's farm for 5 years. She went through the ledger in an evening and came back the next morning with questions. "You're overextending on winter feed," she said. "You're buying from Hendricks in October every year at his price. But if you bought from the Morrison operation in September, you'd pay about a third less and the quality's similar. Morrison's a long way. It's a half-day's ride. Worth it at the volume you're buying." He considered. "What else?" "The creek pasture. You're not using it in rotation. If you ran the east herd through there every 3rd week, the north pasture would recover faster and you'd need less supplemental feed." He was quiet for a moment. "My father always kept the creek pasture separate." "For what reason?" He didn't have an answer for that. She could tell he was deciding whether to be irritated or interested. After a moment he said, "Anything else?" "The Dennison situation. Write to the Cheyenne buyers directly. Don't ask about price, just ask about their current capacity. Let them know you've got 80 head ready. See what they come back with. Dennison hears you've made contact with Cheyenne and he'll move faster." Talon looked at her steadily. "You've done this before." "My husband and I ran a farm for 4 years. We made every mistake there was to make the first 2 years and some new ones in years 3 and 4. I paid attention." "Where's the farm now?" "Gone." She said it without drama. "Drought and debt. In that order, more or less." He nodded, the way people nodded when they understood something wasn't open for more questions. And Dusty? Dusty was in his element within 3 days. She'd been a little worried, honestly. He was 4 years old and had been working cattle since he was a year and a half. But the Whitlock farm had been smaller and the herd less varied. She'd wondered if 80 head on 400 acres might be too much stimulus. She should not have worried. On the 3rd morning, she brought him out to the east pasture, where Cal was trying to move 20 head toward the creek and making a mess of it. The cattle were moving the wrong direction. Two had broken off toward the scrub, and Cal was chasing rather than directing. She sent Dusty in on a hand signal and watched him work. He went wide around the herd, low and fast, and brought the two breakaways back before they'd gotten 30 yards. Then he took a position on the far side and held it, applying exactly the right amount of pressure. Not enough to spook, enough to direct. The cattle moved. Cal, catching on, moved to complement rather than counter. Pete, watching from the fence, said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "Huh," which Alara was learning was Pete's version of impressed. Cal was openly delighted. He was young enough to still be openly delighted by things without feeling like it was a loss of dignity, and he followed Dusty's movements with the attention of someone trying to learn. "How does he know?" Cal asked her afterward. "How does he know which one's going to break?" "He reads them," she said. "Same way you read people. You watch long enough, you start to see the ones that are thinking about making a move." Cal looked thoughtful about that in the way 19-year-olds sometimes did, like they'd been handed a piece of information that connected to something larger. Du sub. 3 weeks in, she started to notice small things about Talon that she hadn't seen at first. He was careful about papers, more careful than made immediate sense. She'd noticed it the first time she went to the office to use the ledger. He'd been at the desk and had closed a folder quickly when she came in, which wasn't remarkable by itself except for the slight tightness around his jaw when he did it. He got a piece of mail from a law office in Cheyenne that he read on the porch alone and didn't mention. Once, a writer she didn't know came to the ranch in the evening, and Talon went out to meet him at the gate rather than inviting him in, and the conversation was short and conducted at a distance, and afterward Talon came in and ate supper without saying what it had been about. She didn't ask. She'd been hired to work cattle, not to know his business. But she noticed. She was good at noticing. Thomas had always said she noticed things 2 weeks before she acknowledged them, which was both a compliment and a criticism, depending on what day he'd said it. The thing she noticed and didn't acknowledge yet was that she wasn't miserable here. That was strange enough to be worth noting, even quietly and only to herself. She'd arrived in Redstone Crossing in the grip of a year that had taken everything from her, and she'd expected, not consciously, but in the dim background way of expectations you didn't examine, that nothing would feel right for a long time, that she'd be getting through each day rather than living it. And she was working hard, and the work was honest and physical and real, and at the end of the days she was tired in the clean way rather than the hollow way, and that was different from what she'd had in a long time. She also noticed, and even more carefully chose not to acknowledge, that Talon Mercer, for all his brevity and his closed-off manner and his habit of moving through a room without quite settling in it, was a man who meant what he said, who kept his word without making a performance of it, who treated Pete and Cal with a quiet respect that wasn't affection exactly, but was genuine and consistent. And she noticed that he never once looked at her in the way she'd been half-braced for when she took the job, the way some men looked at a woman alone, like she was a problem they'd found a solution to. He looked at her the way you looked at a colleague, directly and with attention, but without anything predatory underneath it. That was not a nothing thing. She'd learned that about men the hard way. On a Wednesday, near the end of her 3rd week, a delivery came from Laramie, a crate of tools and a box of mail that had been held at the post office and forwarded. Alara signed for it and brought it inside, setting the mailbox on the desk for Talon to go through when he came in from the south pasture. She went back to the office 20 minutes later for the ledger. The box was open. Talon had been through some of it quickly. Envelopes were scattered on the desk. One folder had been pulled and set aside, and something had fallen out of it, or been pulled out and not replaced. She shouldn't have looked. She knew she shouldn't have looked. But the word on the top of the paper caught her eye before she'd consciously registered that she was reading it, because it was a word she recognized. The words wanted and accused, and, in larger type below both of those, the name Talon Mercer. She picked it up. Her hands were steady, which surprised her. It was a notice from the Western Territorial Railroad Company, dated 2 years ago, accusing one Talon Mercer of illegal seizure and occupation of land granted under the Territorial Land Act, specifically 412 acres in Redstone Valley, currently known as the Mercer Ranch. She read it twice. Then she set it down where she'd found it. She stood in the office for a moment with her back against the wall and looked at the floor and thought about what that meant. What it actually meant, not what the paper said. She thought about the rider at the gate, the law office in Cheyenne, the quick closing of folders. She thought about a man who'd walked across a street because a dog was howling and bought him back from a trader and handed the rope to a stranger and offered work and room and kept every word of the agreement they'd made. She thought about Thomas, who had been a good man and an honest one, and who in the last year of his life had spent every dollar they had, trying to fight a company that was trying to take their land on legal grounds that he'd always said were fraudulent. She pushed off the wall and went out to the barn. She found a saddle blanket that needed mending and sat down with a needle and thread and worked on it until her hands stopped shaking. Dusty came and put his head in her lap, because Dusty always knew. "I know," she said. "I know." She didn't know what she was going to do about it yet, but she knew she wasn't leaving, not until she understood what she was actually in the middle of. The sun was going down over the ridge to the west, turning the sky the color of old copper, and somewhere in the south pasture she could hear the cattle moving and the low sound of Pete's voice carrying across the flat ground. And closer than that, Talon's boots on the barn's wooden approach, coming in from the day's work. She kept her eyes on her mending and waited. Talon came into the barn the way he always did at the end of the day, unhurried, pulling his gloves off finger by finger, already thinking about the next thing on the list before the current thing was finished. He checked on the bays first, running a hand along the nearest one's neck, checking the water bucket, the same routine every evening in the same order. He didn't notice her right away. She was in the corner with the saddle blanket, and she didn't announce herself. And for a moment she watched him move through the barn with that particular competence that people had when they were completely at home in a space. And she thought about the piece of paper on the desk in the office, and she thought about what she was going to say. She'd decided not to pretend she hadn't seen it. That was the kind of thing that rotted, keeping it. Thomas had taught her that, not by example, but by counter-example. The one year they'd had a dispute with a neighboring farmer that he'd tried to manage by not talking about it. And it had gotten worse every month until it exploded into something that cost them $200 and 6 months of bad feeling. "I saw something I shouldn't have," she said. Talon stopped. His back was to her. He didn't turn immediately. "The office," she said. "I came in for the ledger. Something had fallen out of a folder." He turned then. His face was careful, not guilty exactly, but guarded in the way of someone who had been waiting for a particular shoe to drop and was now watching it fall. "The wanted notice," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." He stood there for a moment, and she could see him deciding something. She'd gotten better at reading him over the past 3 weeks. Not well, but better. He had a tell when he was about to shut a conversation down, a slight lift of the chin, a pulling back that wasn't physical but might as well have been. She watched for it. It didn't come. Instead, he sat down on a hay bale about 6 feet from her, put his elbows on his knees, and looked at his hands. "All right," he said. She waited. "The Mercer Ranch was my father's," he said. "He built it over 20 years, started with 40 acres and a 2-room house and about nothing else. By the time I was 15, we had 400 acres and a decent operation." He paused. "About 8 years ago, the Western Territorial Railroad started routing a new line through the valley. They needed land. Specifically, they needed a corridor that ran directly across the eastern edge of what was ours. And your father said no. My father said no. They made an offer, a low one, and he turned it down. He'd been on that land his whole working life. It wasn't about the money." He stopped again. Then about a year later, papers appeared. Legal documents showing that the original deed for the eastern parcel, about 80 acres, had belonged to a land trust called the Harmon Development Corporation, which just happened to have sold that parcel to the railroad. Alara put the saddle blanket down. "The deed was forged," she said. "We didn't know that at first. The documents looked right. Had the territorial seal and the surveyor's signatures and everything that was supposed to be there. My father hired a lawyer, spent most of what we had on it, and the lawyer came back and said the documents appeared to be legitimate and the case wasn't winnable." His jaw was tight. 3 years later, I found out the lawyer was on the railroad's payroll, had been the whole time. "Did your father know before he died?" Something moved across his face. He suspected. He never could prove it. He spent the last 2 years of his life trying, and it broke him. He said it plainly, without any drama attached to it, which made it worse somehow than if he'd said it with feeling. "After he died, I kept looking. on my own, with what money I had left. That's when I found a surveyor's record from the original filing, a copy, not the one in the courthouse, that showed the eastern parcel was always part of the Mercer holding. The Harmon Corporation documents were fabricated. The land numbers were transposed in a way the original surveyor would never have done. So the ranch is legitimately yours. Always was. He lifted his head and looked at her directly. But the warrant's still active. Technically, I'm an accused man. If the railroad wanted to push it, they could have me brought in on trespass and illegal occupation. They haven't pushed it because it would mean opening the original documents to scrutiny, and that's a risk they don't want to take. But they haven't dropped it either. It just sits there. His voice was controlled, but she could hear what was under it, years of it. I can't sell the ranch. Can't get a bank loan against it. Can't do a proper legal transfer on anything. Every time someone new comes to town or a new federal marshal gets posted, I spend a week wondering if this is the time they decide to use it. Alara was quiet for a moment. The rider who came to the gate last week, she said. Someone from Cheyenne who keeps an eye on railroad activity for me. Letting me know there's a new company enforcer in the territory, man named Holt Driscoll. He does their, he paused, choosing the word, legal work, which isn't always very legal. What does that mean exactly? It means he's the one they send when they want a problem solved without a courtroom. She absorbed that. Outside the barn, the wind had picked up slightly. She could hear it at the edges of the roof, and Dusty had come to the barn door and was sitting there looking in at her with the patient expression he wore when he decided she'd been somewhere long enough. "Why did you hire me?" she asked. Knowing all this. Knowing that if someone came looking, anyone associated with you could be in a difficult position. He thought about that for a moment. "Because you needed work, and you knew cattle, and your dog was good," he said. "And because—" he stopped. "Because I've been running this place alone for 3 years, and it's been getting worse, not better, and at some point you have to decide whether you're going to keep going or not." It wasn't a romantic thing, the way he said it. It was practical. The declaration of a man who'd been calculating survivability and made a decision. She nodded slowly. "I'm not leaving," she said. He looked at her. "I'm telling you I know, and I'm not leaving," she said. "That's all. You don't have to do anything about me knowing. I just can't sit on something like that and pretend." "Most people would leave," he said. "Most sensible people." "Probably." She picked the saddle blanket back up. "I've been short on sensible for about a year now." Something shifted in his expression. Something that wasn't quite a smile, but lived in the same neighborhood. He stood up, put his hat back on, and looked down at Dusty, who had finally decided the conversation was over, and walked in to lie down against the wall. "Supper's probably cold," he said. "It was never hot," she said. "Cal cooked tonight." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. The Cheyenne letter came back in under 2 weeks, which was fast enough to surprise Talon and confirm what Alara had suspected, that the buyers there had been waiting for someone to contact them directly and hadn't wanted to appear to be poaching Dennison's supplier relationships. She read it over Talon's shoulder at the kitchen table, which she'd started doing without either of them commenting on it, the same way she'd started being present for the morning planning discussions that used to just be Talon and Pete talking quietly over coffee while she worked in the barn. "They're offering 13.2, she said. "Dennison's at 11, Pete said from across the table. "Dennison's about to be at 12, Alara said. "Once you write back to Cheyenne and take the deal, Dennison's going to hear about it. He'll come with a better number. You can either take the Cheyenne deal now or let Dennison sweat for 2 weeks and see what he offers." Talon looked at her. "Which would you do?" "Take Cheyenne," she said. "Dennison's strung you along for 2 months. That's not a man who becomes a good business partner just because he gets nervous. Take the deal you have." Pete nodded fractionally, which she'd learned was his equivalent of vigorous agreement. Talon wrote to the Cheyenne buyers the next morning. The following week, a man from Dennison's office rode up to the gate with an improved offer of $12.50. Talon met him at the gate and told him, politely, that he'd already made other arrangements. Alara heard about it from Pete, who told it with the quiet satisfaction of someone who appreciated watching things go right for once. What happened next was slower to build, the way most of the important things were. Dusty had taken to sleeping in the office at night. She wasn't sure how it had started, but he'd claimed a spot under the desk as his own, and neither Talon nor Pete had objected. He was useful in ways beyond the cattle work. He knew the ranch's sounds the way all good dogs knew a property, its normal rhythms and its off notes, and he had a habit of lifting his head at things that turned out to be worth lifting his head at. The third week, he'd gone alert at 2 a.m, and she'd heard him through the thin wall between the storeroom and the office, and she'd gotten up to find that a section of the south fence had come down in the wind and 3 head had walked out. They'd gotten them back before dawn. Without Dusty, they'd have been chasing cattle halfway to the next county by morning. "That dog pays his own salary," Pete said. "He always did," Elara said. She was settled, though she wouldn't have used that word yet. More like entrenched. Embedded in the daily workings of the place in a way that had happened faster than she'd expected, and that she chose not to examine too closely because examining it might require deciding how she felt about it, and she didn't have the bandwidth for that on top of everything else. She thought about Thomas. Not as often as she used to. That had shifted somewhere in the second week here, not diminishing but changing texture, becoming something she could carry rather than something that carried her. Thomas had been a good man, and she had loved him, and the marriage had been real and true and also deeply imperfect, full of arguments about money and about the farm and about the way she took on problems before asking whether he wanted help with them. She missed the specific weight of him, the sound of his breathing at night, the way he held his coffee cup with both hands even when it was hot. She didn't pretend she was over it. She wasn't. But she was further from it than she'd been, which was all you could ask. She found herself watching Talon sometimes without meaning to, not in a way she was going to do anything about. More in the way you studied a landscape when you lived in it, registering its features, noting which parts were solid and which were still a mystery. He was a complicated man who presented himself as a simple one, and she'd gotten curious about the gap between those two things. He was patient with Cal in a way that seemed slightly effortful, like patience didn't come naturally to him, but he'd decided to practice it anyway. He read every evening, and she'd noticed the books were not novels or light reading, history, mostly, and something about land survey law that she thought was both professionally appropriate and quietly sad. He was harder on himself than on anyone else, which was a trait she recognized because she had a version of it herself. One evening, she came in from the barn to find him at the kitchen table with 3 folders of documents spread out in front of him, cross-referencing something, making notes on a piece of paper. He didn't look up. "The survey records," she said, not asking. "There's a territorial court sitting in Laramie in November," he said. "First time in 4 years the circuit judge is someone who isn't connected to the railroad's legal team." He turned over a page without looking up. "I've been thinking about whether there's enough here to petition." "Is there? Maybe. I've got the original surveyor's copy. I've got a deposition from an old county clerk who remembered the original filing. I've got proof the Harmon Corporation was registered 6 months after the original land grant, which means it couldn't have owned the land before my father." He set his pen down. "But I'm missing a direct link between the forged deed and the railroad. I can prove the deed is wrong. I can't prove the railroad made it wrong. Not yet. Not in a way that would hold up." Elara stood in the doorway for a moment. "Thomas fought the same company," she said. Talon looked up. She'd known she was going to say it eventually. She'd been sitting on it since the night in the barn, turning it over, figuring out how much it meant. "My husband. The farm we lost in Nebraska. The debt wasn't just drought. We'd been in a legal dispute for 2 years before the drought finished us. A land company called Harmon Development. They claimed a section of our water rights." Talon had gone very still. "They said there was an original survey discrepancy," she continued. "Thomas fought it as long as he could. The lawyer he hired turned out to be useless. Wouldn't say why, just stopped returning letters. Thomas kept every document from the case, every piece of paper. When we left the farm, I brought the box with me because I couldn't leave it." She paused. "I don't know exactly what's in it. I never looked after Thomas died, but it's in my room." A silence stretched between them. "Elara," Talon said carefully. "I know," she said. "I know what I'm saying. If that box has what I think it might have, then we should look at it." She said it before she could think herself out of it. "Together, tonight." He looked at her for a moment, a long, considering look, the kind that took in more than just the surface of what she'd said. Then he nodded. She went and brought the box. It was a wooden storage box about the size of a small traveling trunk. The lid warped slightly from moisture somewhere along the journey. Thomas had locked it once, but the lock had broken and he'd never replaced it. She'd carried it from Nebraska to Wyoming on the wagon and shoved it under her cot and not opened it in 14 months. She set it on the table between the folders and the survey records. Her hands were steady again, which still surprised her. She lifted the lid. The smell hit her first, paper and dust and something faintly like Thomas's work jacket, which was irrational because his jacket wasn't in there. But grief did that sometimes, put smells in places that had no business having them. There were documents, a lot of them. Correspondence with the land company, records of the water rights claim, 2 letters from the lawyer, maps with survey lines drawn in Thomas's careful hand, and at the bottom, a bundle wrapped in oilcloth and tied with twine, which she didn't recognize. She lifted the oilcloth bundle and looked at it. "I don't know what this is," she said. "Thomas never showed me." "May I?" She handed it to him. He untied the twine carefully and unwrapped the oilcloth. Inside was a sheaf of documents, 7 or 8 pages, that were not Thomas's handwriting. They were official-looking, formatted, printed, and handwritten in the mixed style of legal documents from a government office. Talon read the top page. His face didn't change, but she saw something happen behind his eyes. The same thing that happened to people when they'd been looking for something for years and had nearly stopped believing they'd find it. "This is an internal filing record," he said slowly, "from the Harmon Development Corporation, listing their land acquisition activity across multiple territories." He turned to the second page. Nebraska, Kansas, Wyoming. He set the second page flat on the table. The Wyoming entry listed the Redstone Valley parcel. The acquisition method was listed as TD7, which meant nothing to Alara. The legal status column showed 2 words, document replaced. "Document replaced," she said. "That's the forged deed," he said. His voice was quiet and absolutely controlled. "That's the railroad's own record showing they replaced the original document. They kept an internal record. Why would they—" He stopped. "Because they needed to track it," she said, "for their own legal people, to know which parcels were clean and which weren't, in case something came up later. They kept a master list." He looked at her. She looked at him. "That's the link," she said. "That's the direct connection you were missing." He set the papers down and pressed both palms flat on the table and stared at them. She watched him take a breath. Not a shaking one, not a dramatic one, just the breath of someone recalibrating after a very long time of moving in one direction. "This covers Nebraska too," he said. "Your husband's case." "I know." "Alara, if this goes to court, if the judge in Laramie reviews this, it's not just my case. This is evidence of a systematic operation. Dozens of families, maybe." "I know," she said. Outside, the wind had come up again, the Wyoming kind that didn't apologize for itself, rattling the window frame and moving through the grass with a low, continuous sound. Dusty had come out from under the desk and was sitting in the middle of the floor, looking at both of them with the attentive neutrality of a dog at a significant moment. "We need to get this to a lawyer," Talon said. "Not a local one. Someone from outside the territory who doesn't have railroad connections." "The circuit judge in Laramie," Alara said. "You said he was clean." "I said he wasn't connected to the railroad's legal team. That's not quite the same thing, but it's as good as I've got." He stood up. "I need to write to him. Tonight, if possible, before I talk myself out of how important this is." "Write the letter," she said. "I'll make coffee." It wasn't a warm or tender thing she said. It was just the next practical step, offered without ceremony, and he took it the same way. She went to the stove, and he sat back down and picked up his pen, and for a while the only sounds were the wind and the scratch of writing and the coffee water beginning to heat. She thought, Thomas spent 2 years fighting this, and it cost him everything, and he never found this. And then, but he kept it. He wrapped it in oilcloth and put it in a box and brought it with him and never threw it away. She poured the coffee when it was ready and set a cup beside Talon's elbow without interrupting him, and he picked it up without looking and kept writing. The lamp threw its small circle of light across the papers. Her papers, his papers, now the same stack. The evidence of what had been done to both their families by the same hand, in the same handwriting, with the same forged seals. She sat down across from him. She thought about the wagon road into Redstone Crossing and the $1.40 in her pocket and Dusty howling in the trader's post, and the particular random terrible luck of arriving in the worst town on the worst day with nothing left to lose. And how sometimes the worst luck landed you exactly where the important thing was waiting. She didn't say any of that. She drank her coffee and listened to the wind and let Talon finish his letter. The letter went out with the Tuesday Post rider, which meant it would reach Laramie in 4 days if the weather held and 6 if it didn't. Talon had written it 3 times. She'd heard him crumple the first 2 attempts from the other side of the wall, and the final version was 2 pages, careful and precise, the kind of writing that came from someone who'd learned the hard way that imprecision in legal matters cost you everything. He didn't tell her what he'd written exactly, and she didn't ask. She'd given him what she had. The rest was his to carry. The days after that had a different quality to them. Not tense exactly, more like the feeling of a sky that had been building weather for a while and hadn't yet decided what to do with it. They worked. The cattle didn't care about legal proceedings, and the fences didn't fix themselves, and Cal had managed to tangle a length of barbed wire around the water pump handle in a way that took Pete 45 minutes and some language to resolve. Life on a working ranch had a way of demanding your full attention regardless of what was happening in the background, which was either a comfort or a frustration depending on the hour. What changed was the quality of the silences between them. There were a lot of silences. Talon was still not a man who filled space with words just to avoid quiet. But the silences had shifted. Before the night with the documents, the quiet between them had been the careful silence of 2 people observing polite professional distance. After it, the quiet was something else. The kind of quiet that had content in it. That meant things without saying them. She caught him watching her sometimes the way she'd caught herself watching him, and neither of them said anything about it, and that was fine. She wasn't sure she trusted herself with that particular conversation yet. She wasn't sure he was either. Some things needed to wait until the weight of everything else wasn't sitting directly on top of them. Pete noticed. She could tell from the way his eyes moved between them at the supper table, not with any judgment attached to it, just the quiet noticing of a man who'd known Talon a long time and was tracking something new. He didn't say a word, which she appreciated. Cal noticed too, but Cal's noticing was less discreet. He had a tendency to go slightly awkward and over-careful whenever both Talon and Alara were in the same workspace, as if he was afraid of doing something wrong in front of an audience. It was sweet in a slightly exhausting way. About 12 days after the letter went out, a reply came back. Talon read it at the kitchen table before breakfast while Pete and Alara worked around him, and then he read it again. Then he set it down and poured his own coffee, which he usually didn't do. He usually waited for the communal pot that Pete made. The circuit judge will review the petition, he said. He wants the full document set. He says if the Harmon acquisition records are what they appear to be, he can convene a formal review proceeding. He paused. He also says we should know that the Western Territorial Railroad has a legal representative named Aldous Marsh, who has successfully challenged 4 prior petitions against the company, and that we should be prepared for a well-resourced opposition. Pete said, "That's a lot of words for saying it won't be easy." "It won't be easy," Talon agreed. Alara sat down with her coffee. "When does he need the documents?" "He's sitting in Laramie on November 12th. That's 22 days. We have to copy everything," she said. "Originals go to the judge, we keep copies, in separate locations." She looked at Talon. "If someone decided the documents needed to disappear before November 12th, I don't want the only set of them to be in one place." Talon looked at her with a look that acknowledged she'd thought of something he hadn't. "You're right. I've been right before," she said, not with any pride in it. "It doesn't make it feel better." They spent 2 evenings going through everything, both Thomas's documents and Talon's survey records, making careful hand copies. Pete sat with them the second evening and served as the second reader, going over each copy against the original to check for errors, which he did with the same steady attention he brought to fence repair. Dusty lay under the table and slept in intermittent stretches, occasionally lifting his head to check on the room before deciding it was still boring and going back to sleep. It was almost domestic, that process. Almost ordinary. 4 people, 3 people and a dog, sitting around a table in lamplight, working. Alara felt the particular bittersweetness of that, the ache of something that resembled what a life could look like, showing up in the middle of circumstances that might still take it away. She thought about Thomas again that night, Lying in her cot with the copy set wrapped in oilcloth under the floorboard she'd worked loose in the corner. She thought about him staying up late over documents the way they'd just done, his jaw set, his handwriting getting worse the more tired he got, refusing to stop. She thought about the 2 years of fighting he'd done, and the year of dying afterward, and the way he'd wrapped those Harmon papers in oilcloth before he lost the farm, knowing they were important, not knowing what for. She thought he would have been glad about this. Furious at what it had cost, but glad. She also thought, with the particular honesty that came only in the dark and only to herself, she needed to be careful. What she was feeling was real. It had been real for a while, if she was being straight about it, but it had also grown in conditions, isolation and shared purpose, and the simple fact of proximity over weeks, that weren't necessarily a reliable foundation. She'd seen people mistake need for feeling before. She'd even done it herself once, in the year before Thomas, with a man who'd turned out to be neither as kind nor as steady as she'd thought. Talon Mercer was not that man. She was fairly sure of that. But fairly sure was not a thing to act on when the circumstances were still this uncertain. Sleep came eventually. The wind had died down and the ranch was quiet, and somewhere in the dark, Dusty shifted under her cot and exhaled the long, settling sigh of a dog, fully at peace. The writer came on a Wednesday, 10 days before the November sitting. He came in the early afternoon, which was the thing that felt wrong about it first. Legitimate travelers and business visitors came in the morning or just before dusk. Those were the natural travel rhythms. Someone riding in at midday in the flat, hard light had either been pushed to move fast or was making a point about not being inconvenienced by social expectations. Alara was working the east fence line with Cal when Dusty stopped. She'd learned to read his stops. There were different kinds. The casual pause of an animal who'd scented something mildly interesting, the taut, alert stillness of a working dog tracking cattle movement, and then there was this one. He had gone absolutely still, weight forward, nose toward the main road, and she could see the ridge of hair along his spine. "Cal," she said, without looking at him. "Go get Pete. Don't run. Walk normal." "What's Please just do it." Cal went. She stayed where she was and watched the road. The rider came around the low bend about a minute later. A big man on a better-than-average horse, dark coat, no ranch marking on the saddle or the horse's hip. He rode like someone accustomed to covering ground and not like someone who worked the land. Dusty made a low sound that wasn't quite a growl. "Not yet." "Easy," she said. "Easy." She kept working the fence. When the rider pulled up at the ranch gate, she was perhaps 100 yards away, in plain sight, and she watched him from that distance as he dismounted and knocked on the gatepost. In the way that was theoretically polite, but in practice was the way you knocked when you expected the door to open without you having to wait long. Talon came out of the barn. She couldn't hear what was said from where she was, but she could read posture, and what she read was, Talon had known this was coming. The slight set of the shoulders, the stillness he used when he was controlling something, the way he didn't extend his hand for a greeting but didn't step back either. She walked toward the barn, not fast, just heading in. Pete appeared from around the corner of the bunkhouse, and she caught his eye, and he fell into pace about 20 feet to her left without either of them saying a word. As she got closer, she could hear voices. "Courtesy call," the rider was saying. He had a flat voice, the kind of voice that had been trained to sound reasonable regardless of what it was saying. "Nothing formal, just wanted to put a face to the name, Mr. Mercer." "You've done that," Talon said. "I have." The man, she could see him clearly now, maybe 45, with a face that might have been called handsome by someone who didn't look at it long enough to see what was behind it, turned his head slightly and looked at her as she came up to the fence. Not acknowledging her exactly. Registering her, the way you registered an obstacle. "I understand you've been in contact with the court in Laramie." "I've been in contact with a lot of people," Talon said. "Of course." The man smiled. It didn't reach anywhere useful. "My name is Holt Driscoll. I represent the Western Territorial Railroad's legal interests in this territory." She'd known before he said it. The name Talon had told her a week ago, the man who solved problems without courtrooms. "Alara Whitlock," she said, before he could do the thing where he pretended she wasn't there. "I work here." Driscoll looked at her with mild interest, the kind that was meant to seem mild. "Is that right?" The Whitlock name is familiar. He paused, just slightly too long to be natural. Nebraska, perhaps. She felt something cold move through her, but kept her face even. Lots of Whitlocks in Nebraska. He turned back to Talon. I want to be direct with you, Mr. Mercer. The railroad isn't interested in spending the next year in a Laramie courtroom. That's expensive for everyone and, frankly, undignified. There's an offer on the table, a settlement figure, that would resolve the warrant and the land question both. What's the figure? Talon asked. Driscoll named a number. It was not a bad number on the surface. Alara ran it against what she knew of the ranch's actual value, and the eastern parcel specifically, and came out about 40% short. That's 40% under fair value, she said. Driscoll looked at her with the patience of a man deciding how annoyed to be. That's the company's position, he said. The company's position, Talon said, is that they're offering me 40 cents on the dollar for land they don't own, and I shouldn't have to sell. A silence. The good horse shifted its weight, and Dusty, who had come up behind Alara, made the low sound again, and this time Driscoll noticed the dog, and the noticing changed something in his face slightly. A small recalibration. The warrant is a serious matter, Driscoll said. I'd hate to see it become more serious due to poor timing. Is that a threat? Alara asked. It's a reality. He said it pleasantly. Courts take time. Circumstances can change. Documents can be misplaced or found to have issues with their chain of custody that make them difficult to submit as evidence. He smiled again. I'm simply suggesting that a clean settlement is better for everyone than a process that grinds on for years and ends with uncertainty regardless. There it was. She'd been listening for the real message underneath the reasonable voice, and there it was. We know about the documents, and we can make them go away. Talon said nothing for a moment. She watched his jaw, the way it tightened. I'll need time to consider, he said. His voice was completely neutral. Of course, Driscoll said. I'm staying at the Redstone Grand. I'll be there through Friday. He put his hat back on. Think carefully, Mr. Mercer. The offer won't improve with delay. He looked at Alara once more, just once, briefly, and it wasn't threatening exactly, but it wasn't nothing either. Ma'am. He turned his horse and rode back up toward the main road. Nobody spoke until the sound of the hoofbeats had faded. Then Pete said quietly, That man's going to be a problem. He's already a problem, Alara said. She turned and looked at Talon. He was watching the road where Driscoll had been, and his expression had the tight, contained quality of someone who had been scared and was managing it the way people manage things they couldn't afford to let out. He knows about the Laramie petition, she said. Yes. He mentioned chain of custody. He's going to try to get to the documents before November 12th. I know. Talon. She waited until he looked at her. We need to move the originals, not keep them here. He thought about that for a second. Where? She'd been considering it since Driscoll had said chain of custody, running options quickly. Does anyone in town owe you a clear favor? Someone who isn't connected to the railroad, who has a safe or a lockbox, who wouldn't be the first place someone looked, he thought. The postmaster, Walt Giddens. His brother had a parcel dispute with a railroad subsidiary 5 years ago. Lost it. He's got no love for them. Would he hold a sealed package without asking questions? If I asked him the right way. Then we do that tonight, she said. We take the originals into town and we put them with Walt Giddens, and we don't tell anyone except the people in this yard. Pete said, I'll come. One person's less visible than two, she said. Talon, you go. I'll stay here with Pete and Cal. He looked at her for a moment. You want me to go alone? He said. Not objecting, just checking what she was actually saying. I want the originals off this property before Driscoll or whoever he has watching the ranch decides that Friday is a deadline worth enforcing early. She said it straight without dressing it up. I want you to take the documents to someone who will keep them safe and then come back and we'll figure out what comes next. He held her gaze for a moment and she held his. All right, he said. He went to get the documents. She stayed in the yard with Pete and Dusty, and the afternoon went on around them, and she thought about what Driscoll had said, the particular way he'd let Thomas's name sit in the air and then move on, as if it were a card he'd decided not to play yet. That was deliberate. That was a man telling her without telling her that he knew who she was and what she had and what it was worth. He's going to come back, she said to Pete. Yes, Pete said without any inflection, and he's not going to come back alone. Pete looked at the road. No, he said, he's not. Talon left an hour before dark, riding the better of the two bays, with the documents in a canvas satchel and Walt Giddens' name and the plan clear between them. She watched him go from the porch and then went inside and made supper because the work still had to happen, the food still had to be made, and the 5 days between now and when the problem would likely come to a head were still days that people needed to eat through. Cal came in from the barn and ate his supper without knowing anything was different, which she thought was actually a mercy. He was 19. He didn't need to carry this tonight. She and Pete ate together after Cal turned in, at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee and the lamp turned low, and they didn't say much. There wasn't much that needed saying. Pete was a man who had been around long enough to know that some situations only moved in one direction, and you didn't fix them by talking. You fixed them by being ready. You ever been in something like this before? She asked him. He considered that. Cattle drive to Kansas, 1871. Trail boss got jumped by men who wanted the herd. We held them off 2 days before the buyers' riders came up from the south. He turned his cup. Turned out all right. How? Turned out 2 days was all we needed. She nodded. That was about as reassuring as Pete got, which she'd learned to interpret as more reassuring than it sounded. Talon came back at 9. She heard the horse and had the door open before he reached the porch. It's done, he said. Walt's got them. He put them in the lockbox he keeps for the stage line's cash transfers. Separate key, separate lock. He came inside and took his hat off and set it on the table. He looked tired in the way that went deeper than physical. The tiredness of someone who'd been carrying something heavy for a long time and had just put it down long enough to feel exactly how heavy it had been. He said something I want to tell you. She waited. He said Driscoll rode through town this afternoon after he left here and spent about 30 minutes at the telegraph office. Talon sat down. He sent 4 wires. To who? Walt doesn't know the contents, but one of the wires went to a federal marshal's office in Denver, which means Driscoll is trying to use federal jurisdiction to get ahead of the Laramie proceeding. He set his hands flat on the table. And Walt overheard him tell the telegraph operator he'd need the office open early Thursday morning, which means he's expecting answers by then. Thursday was 2 days away. Alara stood in the middle of the kitchen and did the arithmetic of it. 2 days for Driscoll to get a response, possibly a federal marshal, possibly a warrant that would supersede the Laramie circuit sitting, possibly the ability to take Talon into federal custody before November 12th. We can't wait, she said. Talon looked at her. The judge in Laramie, she said. Can he receive the documents before the scheduled sitting if the situation warrants it? I don't know. Write him tonight. Tell him there's a party actively trying to suppress the evidence and obstruct the proceeding. Tell him you have reason to believe a federal instrument is being sought to preempt the court's jurisdiction. Ask him if there's a mechanism to advance the review. Talon was quiet. That's, he started. Aggressive, she said. I know. Do you have a better option? He didn't answer for a moment. She watched him working through it, the same way she'd watched him work through the Dennison situation. Methodically, without ego, trying to find the best path rather than the most comfortable one. No, he said finally. Then write the letter. She made more coffee. The lamp burned and the wind was still outside and Dusty was at her feet under the table, and Talon wrote, she thought about the 5 days to November 12th, now possibly shrunk to 2. She thought about Driscoll's face when he'd named Thomas, the small, careful precision of it. She thought about a man who had spent 2 years dying to fight something he couldn't beat alone and had left behind the one thing that might have made the difference. She thought, we have it now, Thomas. We have it. Outside, somewhere on the far ridge, a coyote sounded once and went quiet again, and the ranch settled into the particular deep silence of a place that was waiting. The second letter went out before dawn on Thursday, carried by the same post rider who'd taken the first one, a man named Ike, who did the Laramie run twice weekly, and who, in Alara's estimation, was either entirely trustworthy or entirely buyable, and she had no way to know which. Talon had paid him an extra $1 to ride straight through without the usual stops, which either meant the letter would arrive faster or that Ike would take the $1 and stop anyway and pocket the difference. Some gambles were just gambles. They didn't talk much that morning. There wasn't much left to say that hadn't already been said, and the saying of it again wouldn't help. Alara worked the cattle in the west pasture with Dusty and thought about the telegraph office in Redstone Crossing and the 4 wires Driscoll had sent and the fact that Thursday morning was already here. By midday, nothing had happened, which was not reassuring. Nothing happening when you expected something meant the something was still building. At 2 in the afternoon, Walt Giddens' boy came out from town on a pony, riding faster than a 13-year-old usually had reason to ride. Alara saw him coming from the fence line and got to the yard before he did. He pulled up and said, slightly breathless, "Mr. Giddens says to tell Mr. Mercer that a wire came back this morning for the man at the hotel. And that same man spent 40 minutes at the sheriff's office this afternoon." He paused for the effect that 13-year-olds deployed when they knew they had important news. "And Sheriff Baird rode out of town about an hour ago on the North Road. The North Road didn't go to Laramie. It curved around the ridge and came back south eventually. But anyone heading to the Mercer Ranch from a direction they didn't want tracked would take the North Road out of town and cut across the valley." Alara gave the boy 50 cents and sent him back. She went to find Talon. He was in the barn with Pete, working on a harness that had cracked at the buckle. She told him what Walt's boy had said and watched his face go through several things in quick succession. Calculation, anger briefly, then the same controlled stillness that she'd come to recognize as him arriving at a decision. "Baird's not a bad man," Pete said slowly, "but he's a practical one." "Meaning he'll serve a warrant if someone hands him one," Talon said. "Meaning he'll serve a warrant and not look too hard at whether it's legitimate," Pete said. "Not the same thing, but close enough." Talon set the harness down. He looked at Alara. "If Driscoll got a federal instrument from Denver, Baird has jurisdiction to execute it. And if he takes me into federal custody—" "You don't make the November 12th sitting," she said, "and the whole thing gets moved into a federal court where the railroad's legal team has 17 years of experience and 4 times the resources." "Yes." "So you can't be here when Baird arrives." He looked at her. "You can't be here," she said again, more plainly. "If you're not on the property, there's nothing to serve. If you ride to Laramie now, tonight, you can put yourself directly in front of the judge. You have the letter. You have Walt's lockbox as the location of the documents. If the judge will see you before the 12th, it's a 4-hour ride in good conditions. Then ride in good conditions." Talon was quiet for a moment. The barn sounds moved around them. The horses shifting, a fly circling somewhere near the ceiling. "I'm not leaving you here," he said. It wasn't romantic. It was direct, the way he said most things. A statement of position. "You're not leaving me," she said. "You're going to do the thing that actually fixes this. Pete's here. Cal's here." She paused. "And Driscoll doesn't want me. He wants you and the documents, and neither of those things will be here. If he figures out the documents are at Walt's, Walt Giddens is a 60-year-old man whose brother got gutted by these same people," she said. "He's not going to tell Driscoll anything. And even if Driscoll gets to the lockbox, he doesn't have the key and federal instruments don't cover stage line property without a second warrant." She was working through it as she said it, feeling for the holes, trying to find what she'd missed. "The copies are here, under the floor in my room. Worthless to him legally, but enough to show the judge what the originals contain if the originals somehow disappeared. It's 2 layers," Pete said from the corner. "She's right." Talon looked at Pete. "You know she's right," Pete said. "You're just arguing because you don't like the part where you ride away." A silence. Something passed across Talon's face that was hard to read. Not quite guilt and not quite fear. Something more tangled than either of those. He looked at Alara and she looked back at him, and she understood in that moment something that she'd been circling for weeks. That she mattered to this man in a way that had moved past professional and past collegial and into something he hadn't asked for and hadn't planned on and didn't quite know what to do with. She understood it because she was in the same position. "Go," she said. Not unkindly. "I'll be here when you get back." He held her gaze for 2 more seconds. Then he turned and began saddling the bay. She helped him pack. Water, hard food, the letter in the inside pocket of his jacket. She didn't make a speech about it. He didn't ask for one. When the horse was ready, he swung up and she handed him his hat, which he'd left on the post, and their hands didn't quite touch but were close enough that the not touching was its own kind of contact. 4 hours, she said. Less, he said, and put his heels to the horse and went. She watched him until the road bent and he was gone. Then she turned around. All right, she said to Pete. Let's figure out what we're doing. What they were doing, it turned out, was waiting, but waiting with intention, which was different from just waiting. Pete moved the horses out of the main barn and into the smaller outbuilding on the south side, which took them out of immediate sight from the main road. Cal, who had been informed of the basic facts in the bluntest terms Pete could manage, was sent to the hayloft with instructions to stay there and watch the north road and come down when called and not a moment before. He'd argued about this briefly, and Pete had said, "Do you want to help or do you want to get in the way?" And Cal had gone to the hayloft. Alara brought the copy documents out from under the floorboard and wrapped them again and put them in her canvas bag, which she slung over her shoulder. She thought about where to put them if things went sideways. Not in the house, which would be the first place searched. She settled on the water tank on the south side, which had a hollow space between its outer wall and the inner liner where the insulation had rotted out. She'd noticed it 2 weeks ago and meant to tell Pete it needed fixing. Now she wedged the oilcloth package into the gap and pressed it flat and replaced the plank she'd removed to access it. Dusty watched all of this with close professional attention. "I don't have a job for you yet," she told him, "but stay close." He stayed close. They came at 4:30 when the light had gone low and amber and was throwing long shadows across the valley floor. There were 3 of them. Sheriff Baird, who was a compact man in his 50s with the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades in the sun. Holt Driscoll, still on his good horse, still in his dark coat. And a third man she didn't recognize, younger, with the flat eyes and the way of sitting a horse that spoke of someone hired for physical work rather than legal work. She was standing on the porch when they came up the road. She'd made a deliberate decision about where to stand and how to stand. Not inside. Inside was defensive, and defensive was weak. Not in the yard scrambling to meet them. That was anxious. The porch was neutral ground, visible, and it meant they had to come to her rather than her going to them. She watched them pull up at the gate. Baird spoke first, which was appropriate since he was the only one with actual legal standing here. "Miss Whitlock, is Talon Mercer on the property?" "No," she said. Driscoll's face didn't change. He'd probably expected this. "When did he leave?" Baird asked. "I didn't look at a clock," she said. "Where did he go?" "He didn't say." Baird shifted in the saddle with the slight discomfort of a man serving a process he wasn't entirely comfortable with. "I have a federal instrument here requiring Mr. Mercer to present himself to the federal marshal's office in Denver within 48 hours. I'm required to inform any persons on the property of this instrument's existence." "Consider me informed," she said. Driscoll rode slightly forward, not past the gate, that would have been trespass, but up to it, so that he was closer than Baird now, which was a message about who was actually running this interaction. "Miss Whitlock," he said, "I want to make sure you understand your own position clearly." "I understand it fine. There are documents that belong to the Western Territorial Railroad's legal records that we believe may be on this property. Documents removed without authorization from their chain of custody." He said it smoothly, with the particular lawyer's fluency that turned theft into recovery and victims into perpetrators. "Possession of those documents by an unauthorized party could be construed as obstruction. I'd want to see the specific statute you're citing," she said, "in writing, with the correct territorial registration." He looked at her with the first expression she'd seen from him that wasn't fully controlled. Not anger. Something more like recalibration, like he'd been expecting a rancher's widow to fold under legal language, and instead found someone who knew what a statute citation was. "We'd like to search the property," he said. "No," she said. Sheriff Baird has a federal instrument requiring Talon Mercer to present himself somewhere," she said. "That is not a search warrant. It does not authorize entry or search of private property. If you have a search warrant, show me the document. If you don't, you're standing at the gate of a private ranch and you've been told no." Baird looked at Driscoll. Driscoll looked at Alara. The third man, the hired one, was looking at the yard with a kind of flat assessment that she didn't like. She tracked him without looking directly at him, the way she tracked cattle that were thinking about breaking, in her peripheral vision, watching for the shift of weight. Dusty was sitting at her feet. He'd been still since they arrived. Not the high-alert stillness he'd shown with Driscoll's first visit, but something lower and more patient. Waiting. "Miss Whitlock," Driscoll said, and his voice had gone quiet in a way that was worse than the smooth legal tone. "I want to be honest with you. Talon Mercer is a man with a federal warrant and nowhere to run. Whatever you think you're protecting him from, you cannot protect him from a federal instrument. This is going to resolve in the railroad's favor one way or another. The only question is what it costs everyone along the way. Is that all? She said. A pause. One more thing, he said. Your husband, Thomas Whitlock. He filed against the Harmon Development Corporation in Lancaster County, Nebraska, case number 1887-44C. He lost. His voice was flat and final. He spent everything he had, lost everything he built, and died trying to fight something that was never going to go his way. I'd hate to see his widow make the same mistake. She felt it land. She felt the specific weight of it, the deliberate use of Thomas's name and Thomas's failure as a hammer, and she stood there and took it and let it be what it was, a threat dressed up as concern. And she did not let a single thing she was feeling reach her face. Thomas fought alone, she said, with a lawyer who was on your payroll and documents that had been hidden from him. She looked at Driscoll directly. He didn't have what I have. And what's that? She didn't answer that. She turned and went inside and closed the door, and she stood with her back against it in the front room and breathed. And on the other side of the door, she could hear the low exchange of voices and then the sound of horses moving. After a minute, she went to the window and watched them go. Driscoll and the third man heading back up the north road, Baird hanging back slightly, turning his horse toward the main road to town. Baird paused once and looked back at the ranch, and the look on his face was not the look of a man satisfied with his afternoon's work. It was the look of a man who knew the water he was wading in was deeper than he'd been told. Good, she thought. She found Pete around the back of the barn, where he'd positioned himself during the conversation with a rifle resting in the crook of his arm in a way that was technically casual and practically not. They're gone, she said. For now, he said. The third man, she said. The one with Driscoll. Did you recognize him? Pete's jaw tightened slightly. Lyle Cannon. He's been through the territory twice before. He does work for hire. What kind of work? The kind you don't put in writing. Pete finally lowered the rifle. He's going to come back tonight. Not with Baird. She'd thought the same thing. Then we need to be awake, she said. They told Cal the bare minimum. There might be trouble tonight. Here's what you do if it comes. Here's what you do not do under any circumstances. And Cal, to his credit, listened carefully and asked 2 intelligent questions, and then went back to the hayloft as directed. The evening went on around them in its ordinary way, which was the disorienting part. The cattle needed checking. The water needed pumping. The horses in the South outbuilding needed feed and water, and Pete gave it to them methodically while Alara made supper that none of them ate much of. She thought about Talon on the road to Laramie. 4 hours in good conditions. He'd left at 6, which meant he'd arrive around 10 if the road was clear. And then finding the judge, not banging on the courthouse door at 10 at night, which wasn't how circuit courts worked. Finding where the judge was staying, explaining the situation to someone who had no reason yet to trust him except a letter and a story and the documents in Walt Giddens' lockbox that were 4 hours back in the other direction. It was a lot of loose pieces. Loose pieces had ways of failing. She washed the supper plates and stoked the fire down low and turned the lamp off in the kitchen. The house sat dark. Outside, the moon was up, 3/4 full, throwing good light across the valley, which was a mixed thing. Good visibility for watching, but also for being watched. She sat in the chair by the front window with Dusty at her feet and Pete somewhere in the dark outside. And she waited. It was well past midnight when Dusty moved. Not a sudden movement. The subtle shift of a dog whose attention had locked onto something. He was off her feet and at the wall between the front room and the office before she'd fully registered it. His nose working, his ears both up, the ridge of hair along his spine just barely raised. She was already moving. She went to the back door and opened it silently and made the low whistle she and Pete had agreed on, 3 short, and heard him answer from the direction of the water tank. 2 short, meaning he saw something too. Then she heard it. Not hoofbeats. They'd be too smart for that. Boots on dry ground, moving slowly, from the east side of the property. 1 set, maybe 2. The kind of movement that was trying hard not to be heard, which paradoxically made it more audible to anyone who was listening for it. Dusty had gone to the east window of the office. He was absolutely still, which was his most serious setting. Easy, she breathed. She went to the front door and cracked it 2 inches and looked out. In the moonlight, she could see the main yard clearly. The gate, the fence line, the dark shape of the barn. Nothing moving there. The sound was on the east side, toward her room, toward the storeroom. They were going for her room. Which meant Driscoll, or someone who'd watched the property, had figured out where she slept and had guessed, correctly, that if she had documents, that was where they'd be. She had already moved the copies to the water tank. The room was empty of anything useful to them. But that wasn't the point. The point was that there were people on the property in the dark, and that was its own kind of problem, regardless of what they found or didn't find. She heard Pete's footsteps on the east side, deliberate now, not hiding himself anymore. And a voice said, sharp and low, "Hey!" And then a thud, and silence. Alara came off the porch. She came around the east side of the house in the moonlight and found Pete standing over a man face down in the dirt, Pete's rifle in his hands, and 6 feet away, Lyle Cannon standing with his hands slightly away from his body, and the particular stillness of a man who had just recalculated his situation. "He's got a partner somewhere," Pete said. He wasn't even breathing hard. Dusty had come around behind her and was already moving to the north, nose down, tracking. He went about 30 yards and then stopped and looked back at her. "Go on," she said. He went another 20 yards and stopped again, and she followed, and in the moonlight she could see the shape of a man crouched at the corner of the fence, and the man could see her and the dog both. And he made the decision that most people made when a healer was tracking them with serious intent. He stood up with his hands up. "I'm not armed," he said. A young voice, nervous. "That's your best feature right now," she said. She walked him back to the yard at the end of Dusty's implied supervision, which was more effective than any leash because Dusty kept pace about 3 feet behind him, and the man could hear him there without being able to see him, which worked on the imagination considerably. Pete had Cannon on his feet now, hands behind his back, wrists tied with a piece of harness leather that Pete had apparently had ready in his pocket, which said something about Pete's level of preparation that Alara found deeply reassuring. The young man was 19, maybe 20. He worked odd jobs in town, he said, when Pete asked in a voice that left very little room for not answering. Driscoll had paid him $3 to come out here and look for papers in the woman's room and bring back whatever he found. $3, Pete said. The young man nodded. "That's not much," Pete said, "for breaking into a woman's room at midnight." The young man had no response to that would improve his situation. Cannon said nothing. He looked at the house, looked at Alara, looked at Pete, ran some private calculation, and kept his mouth shut. He was a professional at whatever it was he did, and professionals didn't give you information for free. "Baird's going to have a complicated morning," Alara said. Pete made the sound that meant agreement. She looked at Cannon. "Where's Driscoll now?" "Nothing." "He sent you out here," she said, "which means he's somewhere close. He wouldn't send men in and not be near enough to manage what comes next." Cannon looked at the fence post. "He's at the hotel," the young man said. Pete and Alara both looked at him. He had the grace to look slightly ashamed of himself. "He told us to go in, get what we could, be back by 2. He was going to be at the hotel." "Doing what at the hotel at 2 in the morning?" she said. The young man hesitated. He said he had a wire coming from Denver about a federal marshal. She looked at Pete. "He's moving the timeline up," she said. "He wanted whatever documents you had here tonight so that when the federal marshal arrives tomorrow, there's nothing to contest the warrant with." She thought through it. "He doesn't know the originals are at Walt's. He thinks everything's here, which means he's going to figure out they're not here about an hour from now when these two don't come back with anything," Pete said. She nodded. "And then he's going to go to Walt." They looked at each other. "Cal," she said. Cal came down from the hayloft at a run when Pete called him. He was given the single most important instruction of his 19 years. Ride to Walt Giddens' house right now, wake him up, tell him to move the lockbox, or at minimum move himself and the key somewhere Driscoll can't find easily before morning. Take the good horse. Ride fast. Don't stop for anything. Cal, who had never been trusted with anything this important in his life, listened to the whole instruction with the focused attention of someone who understood the stakes, nodded once, and went for the horse. She watched him go. Then she sat down on the porch steps because her legs had decided they'd been cooperating long enough, and Dusty came and put his head in her lap, and she put her hand on him and felt him breathing. Pete stood in the yard with Cannon and the young man sitting against the fence, and the moon moved its slow way across the sky, and Laramie was 4 hours away, and Talon was somewhere in between, and the night was not over yet. "You did good," Pete said from the yard. He wasn't looking at her when he said it, which was somehow what made it feel genuine. "Dusty did good," she said. Pete looked at the dog. "Yeah," he said. "He did." She sat there on the steps with her hand on Dusty and the night around her and thought about Thomas's oilcloth package sitting in a water tank 50 feet away, and about a judge in Laramie who might or might not open his door to a man with a warrant on his head, and a story that was almost too large to be believed, and about the particular narrow thread that everything was hanging on right now, and how a single day could hold this much weight and still not break. The dawn, when it came slow and gray and without ceremony. The gray came in slow and cold off the ridge, the kind of early morning that didn't offer much in the way of comfort. Elora had not slept. She'd sat on the porch steps until the sky started changing color, then made coffee she didn't want and stood at the kitchen window with it and watched the road. Pete had tied Cannon and the young man, whose name, it eventually came out, was Eddie Foss, to the fence post on the south side of the yard. Not cruelly, but not loosely either. He'd given them water once during the night without being asked, which was Pete's version of magnanimity toward men who'd broken onto his employer's property in the dark. Cannon hadn't said anything since his initial silence. Eddie Foss had said quite a lot, mostly apologetic, most of it genuine. He was 20 years old and had come to Redstone Crossing 6 months ago from somewhere in Kansas looking for work, and $3 was $3 when you had 4 cents to your name. Elora understood that mathematics completely. She didn't hold it against him in any useful way, but she couldn't let him go until this was resolved, because if Driscoll knew his 2 men hadn't come back, he'd already be moving. Cal had not returned from Walt Giddens, which she chose to read as good news. It meant Walt was awake and the situation was being managed, and Cal was sitting somewhere with the good horse waiting to see what happened next, the way she'd told him to. The coffee went cold. She refilled it, and it went cold again. Around 6:15, Pete came to the kitchen door and said, "Ryder?" She was outside before he finished the word. The rider coming down the south road was not Talon. It was a man she'd never seen, older, 60s perhaps, slight in build, on a horse that was clearly a hired animal from a livery. He rode carefully, the way people rode when their bodies had opinions about it. He wore a coat with a territorial seal pin on the lapel. Behind him, a half-length back, rode Talon. She stood in the yard and watched them come and felt something loosen in her chest that had been locked for most of the night. Talon looked tired, the specific tiredness of a man who'd ridden 4 hours, done hard talking for several more, and ridden back. His hat was pushed back slightly and there was dust on everything, but he was upright and moving, and the expression on his face was not defeat. They pulled up at the gate. The older man dismounted carefully, one hand on the saddle horn for balance, and looked at the property with the assessing eyes of someone accustomed to examining things in dispute. "This is Judge Clarence Howell," Talon said. "Circuit Court, Laramie." Elora looked at the judge. He had a face full of the particular lines that came from decades of listening to people tell him their problems, and the steady, unhurried quality of someone who had decided long ago that being rushed was a choice he wasn't going to make. "Miss Whitlock," he said. His voice was dry and precise. "Mr. Mercer's told me quite a bit about you." "Did he tell you we have 2 of Driscoll's men tied to a fence post?" she said. The judge looked at Pete, who was standing to the left of the gate, with the rifle resting in the crook of his arm in its technically casual way. "He did not mention that specifically," the judge said. "It was a recent development," Talon said. Judge Howell did not react to Cannon and Eddie Foss the way a civilian might have. He looked at them with the mild professional interest of a man cataloging a situation, asked Pete 2 direct questions about the circumstances of their detention, and then told Pete to keep them where they were for the time being. He went into the house. Talon came to where Elora was standing by the water tank and stopped about 3 feet from her and looked at her in a way that took stock of everything. Whether she was all right, whether the night had cost her anything visible, whether the version of things he'd been imagining on the ride back matched what had actually happened. "You're okay," he said, not asking exactly. Confirming. "I'm okay," she said. Dusty found the second man before he got to the storeroom. Pete handled Cannon. She paused. Cal's at Walt's. Walt's safe. I stopped there on the way back. He'd ridden past Laramie coming home, taken the detour specifically. The lockbox is fine. Walt's fine. Cal's drinking Walt's coffee and has apparently been talking Walt's ear off since 3 a.m. She felt something in her release further. The judge came all this way. He'd already reviewed the letter. He said the situation I described warranted an immediate response, rather than waiting for the scheduled sitting. Talon pulled his hat off and turned it in his hands. He read the acquisition records I'd copied out for him, said he'd never seen a more brazen, his word, internal document, a corporation keeping records of its own fraud. They kept it because they needed it, she said. They were running the same operation in multiple territories. They needed to track which parcels were clean and which had been doctored so their own legal people didn't step on each other. That's exactly what the judge said. He looked at her. Alara, he thinks this covers at least 40 families, maybe 60, across Nebraska, Kansas, Wyoming, and parts of Colorado. The number sat in the air between them. 40 families. 60. People who had lost farms, ranches, water rights, land they'd built their lives on, to forge documents and bought lawyers and the slow institutional weight of a company that had more money than any individual could fight. Thomas was one of them. Talon's father was one of them. And somewhere in the records, if you looked, there would be dozens more names, dozens more lives reduced to a line item in a ledger that said, document replaced. He can actually do something about it, she said. He said he can convene an emergency proceeding. Today. Here. Talon put his hat back on. He wants the originals from Walt. He wants to review everything before Driscoll makes any other moves, because once the federal marshal arrives, when does the marshal arrive? Today, maybe. Tomorrow at the latest. She looked at the house, where Judge Howell was inside doing whatever judges did when they were preparing to convene something. Then she looked at Cannon, still tied to the fence post, watching everything with his flat professional eyes. Driscoll doesn't know the judge is here, she said. No. When he figures out his men didn't come back with anything, he's going to come here himself. Talon nodded slowly. Probably. Good, she said. He looked at her. Let him come, she said. Let him come here and find a circuit judge sitting in your kitchen with 40 families' worth of evidence on the table. Let him do whatever he was planning to do in front of someone with the actual authority to respond to it. Talon looked at her for a long moment. She couldn't entirely read what was in his face. Exhaustion, certainly, and something else underneath it that had more warmth in it than he usually let show. You want to use him, he said. I want him to walk into his own consequence, she said. There's a difference. Something that was almost a real smile crossed his face. You know, he said, most people hired on to work cattle don't end up coordinating legal strategy. I didn't plan on it, she said. It just kept being the next thing. Cal came back with the horse and a message from Walt Giddens that he'd be in town with the lockbox by 8, which was in 40 minutes. Judge Howell had set himself up at the kitchen table with his reading glasses and the copies of the documents, working through them with the focused, unhurried attention of a man who understood that the difference between justice and injustice often lived in the details of language on a page. Pete made more coffee without being asked. He also made biscuits, which surprised everyone, including Pete, who seemed slightly surprised at himself. They were not good biscuits. They were dense and slightly undercooked in the center, and everyone ate them without comment because it was 6 a.m. and there was nothing else, and Pete had made them in a spirit of contribution that deserved respect, regardless of the outcome. Dusty ate half a biscuit Cal gave him, chewed it experimentally, and then carried it to his spot under the desk and left it there. Even the dog knows, Cal said quietly. Eat your biscuit, Pete said. Walt arrived at 8:10, driving his own buckboard with the lockbox in the back covered by a canvas tarp, his wife sitting beside him with an expression that suggested she'd been told enough of the situation to be worried and not enough to stop worrying. Walt was a spare, straight-backed man who moved with economy and set the lockbox on the kitchen table in front of Judge Howell with the gravity of someone who understood what he was delivering. Mr. Giddens, the judge said, you've been careful with this. My brother lost 40 acres to these people in 1882, Walt said. I've been careful. The judge opened the lockbox. He spent an hour with the documents. Nobody talked much during that hour. Alara sat by the window and watched the road and drank her third coffee of the morning, which was at least two more than she needed, and thought about nothing in particular because thinking about everything in particular was too much to hold at once. Talon sat at the far end of the table and watched the judge read with the expression of a man who had been waiting for years for a room like this. A room with the right person in it, with the right papers in front of them, with enough truth assembled in one place to actually be useful. She could see the weight of the waiting in his face. How long it had been. How much it had cost. She thought about his father building 400 acres over 20 years, starting with almost nothing, the way people did out here, the way her own parents had, the way Thomas had tried to. The particular faith required to build something slowly with your hands in a place that had no guarantees, faith not in anything abstract but in the work itself, in the accumulated days, in the idea that what you made was yours and would stay yours. And then a company decides it wants your land, and it has lawyers and money and patience on a scale you can't match, and it makes a document that says the land was never yours to begin with. And you can see the lie in it, and you can feel the lie, and you can spend years trying to prove the lie, and it still grinds you down because that's what it's designed to do. Thomas had known that. He told her once, in the second year of the fight, that the hardest part wasn't the legal work or the money or even the fear. It was the way the company's confidence made you doubt yourself, made you think, in the dark hours, maybe I've got the facts wrong. Maybe they're right, and I've been wrong all along. Because they said it so many times with such institutional certainty that the doubt crept in through the edges. Thomas had not been wrong. He'd never been wrong. He'd just been alone. At 9:40, Judge Howell set down the last document and took off his reading glasses and looked around the room. "These records," he said, "constitute the most direct evidence of systematic land fraud I have encountered in 23 years on the circuit." He folded his glasses and put them in his coat pocket. The Harmon Development Corporation's own acquisition logs showed deliberate document replacement in 14 separate cases across 4 territories. Mr. Mercer's original survey records demonstrate conclusively that the Redstone Valley parcel was never held by Harmon or any predecessor entity. The warrant against Mr. Mercer was obtained on the basis of fraudulent documentation. He looked at Talon. "It's void. I'm voiding it today in writing, and I'll file the formal order when I return to Laramie." The kitchen went quiet. Talon's hands were flat on the table. He said nothing for a moment. "The broader case," the judge continued, "will require a full territorial proceeding. I'll be recommending to the federal court that the Harmon acquisition records be seized as evidence and that the Western Territorial Railroad's legal team be required to answer for their role in the fraud." He paused. "That process will take time. Months, likely more. Not all of the affected families will recover what they lost. Some of those cases are too old, the statute is complicated, and I won't make promises I can't keep. But the fraud will be on record. The company will be held to answer for it." He looked at Alara. "The Nebraska cases, your husband's among them, will be included in the proceeding. I can't give you the farm back, Miss Whitlock, but I can make sure what was done to your husband is part of the public record, and that the people who did it don't do it again." She nodded. She didn't trust her voice right at that moment, which was fine because the judge had already moved on. He was writing the warrant void order when the sound of a horse came from the road. One horse, moving at a business-like pace. Dusty was at the window before anyone else had registered it, and this time he didn't make the low warning sound. He made the higher, sharper sound, the one he'd made the night Alara had almost left him at the trader's post. The one that meant something significant is happening right now, and I need you to pay attention. "That'll be Driscoll," Pete said. Alara stood up. She looked at Talon. He looked at her. She shook her head slightly. "Stay here," and went to the door. Holt Driscoll came to the gate alone, which either meant he'd decided the situation called for a different approach or that he'd run out of men to send in first. He looked the same as he always did, controlled, composed, the dark coat and the good horse and the flat professional eyes. But there was something slightly different this morning, a tightness around his jaw that hadn't been there before. He saw Alara on the porch. He saw Cannon and Eddie Foss at the fence post. He looked at them for a moment and then looked back at Alara, and she could see him recalculating, the same recalibration she'd watched happen yesterday when she'd asked about statute citations. "Miss Whitlock," he said. "Careful now." careful in a way he hadn't been before. "Mr. Driscoll," she said, "I'd like to speak with Mr. Mercer." "He's inside," she said. "So is Judge Howell. They're finishing some paperwork." A pause. Something moved in Driscoll's face that was the first genuinely human expression she'd seen from him. Not the smooth lawyer's face or the veiled threat face, but the face of a man who had just understood that the room he'd walked into was not the room he'd planned for. "Judge Howell," he said. "Circuit Court, Laramie," she said. "He rode out this morning. He's been reviewing the Harmon Development Corporation's acquisition logs." "Interesting reading." She paused. "The internal kind, I mean. The ones that list which deeds were replaced." Driscoll sat very still on his horse. "Those documents belong to the railroad's legal archive," he said. His voice was still controlled, but the control was working harder now. "The judge has a different view on that," she said. "You're welcome to come in and discuss it with him." Another pause. She watched him decide. This was the moment she'd thought about since she'd told Talon to let Driscoll come. The moment where a man like this, smart, experienced, accustomed to being the person with the most leverage in the room, had to calculate whether walking into that kitchen was a move that helped him or finished him. He had a federal marshal coming. He had legal resources she didn't. He had the weight of a large company behind him. What he didn't have was a different version of those acquisition records, and he knew it. He dismounted. He tied his horse at the gate with the careful deliberateness of someone using the action to buy thinking time. Then he walked up to the porch and looked at her at close range for a moment. "You're not what I expected," he said. It wasn't quite a compliment. "I know," she said, and held the door open. She would not remember the next hour in sequence. It came back to her afterward in pieces. The judge's voice, precise and without theater, laying out the evidentiary record in the kitchen that had become a makeshift court. Driscoll sitting across the table with the particular stillness of a man who had been outmaneuvered and was still working out how badly. Talon beside her not saying much, not needing to. Pete standing in the doorway with his arms crossed. Walt Giddens at the end of the table with his hands around a coffee cup he wasn't drinking from. Driscoll did not confess. Men like Driscoll did not confess. What he did was go quiet in a careful, calculating way. And when the judge laid the void order in front of him and told him the federal proceeding was being recommended, he looked at it for a long time and then said he would need to contact the railroad's legal team. "You'll have the opportunity to do that," the judge said, "after I've filed the order and notified the federal court. I'd suggest your legal team review the acquisition records carefully before they decide on a strategy, because the record is," he paused, precise as always, "comprehensive." Driscoll left without saying anything else to Alara. He walked past her on the porch without looking at her, which she understood as its own form of acknowledgement, that she'd been the variable he hadn't accounted for, and looking at her would mean admitting that. She stood on the porch and watched him ride back up the road, and then didn't watch anymore. When she went back inside, Sheriff Baird had arrived. He'd come quietly while she was on the porch, apparently having heard from someone in town that the judge was at the ranch, and he was talking to the judge in the low, careful voice of a man who was assessing exactly how much trouble he was in for having served Driscoll's instrument. The judge was being neither harsh nor soft about it, just factual, which Alara thought was probably worse than either. Cannon was formally placed under arrest. The judge had enough on the record to justify it. And Eddie Foss was released with the kind of talking to that the judge appeared to reserve for young men who'd made bad decisions in temporary circumstances. Eddie Foss left looking considerably more shaken than when he'd arrived, which was probably the intended effect. Cal watched the whole thing from the doorway of the barn with the expression of someone whose understanding of how the world worked was being significantly revised. By afternoon it was over, or the immediate shape of it was over. The judge had his documents, Baird had his arrest, and the larger federal proceeding was a thing that would grind on for months through courts and filings and processes that none of them would be present for most of the time. That was the nature of justice when it finally came, slow and procedural, and not at all like the clean resolution that the situation seemed to call for in the moment. Judge Howell shook Talon's hand before he rode back to town. He shook Alara's too, which she thought was a deliberate choice on his part. The Nebraska case was always provable, he told her. Your husband's lawyer should have seen it. His lawyer was bought, she said. I know, the judge said. That's in the record, too. He rode out. Walt Giddens followed, the empty lockbox in his buckboard, his wife beside him looking considerably less worried than she had this morning. Pete took Cal to work on the east fence, which needed doing, and which Pete apparently felt was the appropriate response to an emotionally significant morning. Put your hands on something concrete and get on with it. She heard them talking as they went, Pete's low voice and Cal's higher one, and she thought that in a year Cal would be a solid hand, and in 5 years he'd probably have his own operation somewhere. And Pete had probably thought the same thing and was already investing accordingly. She was sitting on the porch steps with Dusty when Talon came out. He sat down beside her. Not close, but not far. The natural distance of two people who had stopped being careful about distance without making a decision about it. They sat for a while without talking. The valley was doing its afternoon thing, the light going gold and sideways. The cattle visible on the far pasture as small dark shapes moving slowly through the grass. The windmill was turning. A hawk was working a thermal over the south ridge. It was ordinary. That was what struck her. After everything the morning had held, the afternoon was just an afternoon. "My father would have liked you," Talon said eventually. She looked at him. "He was like you," he said. He thought practically. He didn't waste words. He had a temper he kept under control most of the time. He paused. He also had a habit of being right when it mattered and not saying "I told you so" afterward, which is rarer than people think. "I don't always keep the temper under control," she said. "No," he said. "But you keep it pointed in the right direction." She looked out at the valley. Dusty had shifted so his back was against her leg, which was his preferred position when he felt the world was basically in order. "What do you do now?" she asked. "The warrant's gone. The ranch is clear, legally. File the deed confirmation with the territorial court," he said. "Get the bank loan I've been unable to get for 3 years. Fix the north fence, which is embarrassing." He thought about it. Probably expand the herd once the cash flow stabilizes. Run the Cheyenne contract through the winter and see what the spring market looks like. She nodded. She'd been thinking about what came next for herself too, though she hadn't said it. The job he'd offered her had been a hand's work on a ranch with an uncertain future. The future was less uncertain now. The terms of what she was doing here had shifted. "I've been thinking," he said, "about the operation." He said it in the careful way of someone who had rehearsed the words and still wasn't sure about them. "The financial management, the cattle rotation you set up, the Cheyenne contact." He stopped. "Pete's good at most things. You said that yourself." "Arithmetic isn't one of them," she said. "Yes, I know. It's more than arithmetic." He looked at the valley. "You see the whole picture, the way it connects, what the cattle need, and what the market's doing, and what the fences need, and how the money has to move through all of it." He paused. "I've been running this place with pieces. You run it like it's one thing." She was quiet. "I'm not offering you a hand's wage," he said. "I'm offering you a stake, equal partnership, your name on the deed alongside mine." He said it without any romance in the words, which made it feel more serious than if he'd dressed it up. "What you brought here, Thomas's documents, the Cheyenne deal, everything with Driscoll. That didn't just save the ranch, it changed what the ranch is, what it can be." He finally looked at her. "That deserves more than $3 a week." She looked back at him. She thought about the wagon road into Redstone Crossing and the $1.40 and Dusty, howling in the trader's post and a stranger crossing a street because the sound was wrong. She thought about the storeroom with the warped floor and Pete's indifferent biscuits, and Cal asking how the dog knew which cow was going to break. She thought about Thomas's oilcloth package sitting in the bottom of a box for 14 months, waiting for the right place to matter. She thought about what it felt like to be somewhere that needed exactly what she had. Not what she was willing to settle for giving, but what she actually had. All of it, the stubbornness and the arithmetic and the temper pointed in the right direction and the capacity to hold someone's fence line in the middle of the night when it needed holding. She'd been a widow in a borrowed wagon looking for her cousin's husband in a town that didn't have room for her. She'd been the woman who almost sold her dog. She'd been the last person anyone would have put money on to walk into a land fraud case and come out the other side with a circuit judge's handshake. None of it had been a plan. None of it had been clean or easy or resolved at the right moments. She had made wrong turns and missed things and been scared in ways she hadn't let anyone see, and she had not, at any point, felt like she knew what she was doing well enough to be confident about it. But here was the valley. Here was the windmill turning. Here was the man beside her who had crossed a street for a howling dog and offered work to a stranger and kept every word of the deal they'd made and ridden 4 hours in the dark to find a judge because it was the thing that needed doing. Here was Dusty's back warm against her leg. "I want it in writing," she said. "Proper legal document, registered with the territorial court." Something shifted in Talon's face. The thing that lived near a smile but had more substance to it. "I'll have Pete witness it," he said. "He's not good at arithmetic, but he writes clearly." "Cal can witness too," she said. "He deserves to be part of something that goes right." They sat there another few minutes in the gold afternoon light, not filling the silence with anything it didn't need. There was a thing she knew that she'd learned the hard way and was still learning, that the life you ended up with was almost never the life you planned, and the people who mattered most were usually not the ones you'd been headed toward when things went wrong. Loss had a way of landing you in the places you were actually supposed to be, not the places you'd carefully arranged to arrive at. It felt like the cruelest kind of navigation until you were far enough from it to see that it was navigation at all. Thomas was gone and the farm was gone, and the year of grief had been as real and as hard as anything she'd ever lived through. She didn't shrink that. She wasn't going to pretend it had all been necessary suffering on the way to something better, because that was the kind of thinking that made loss seem manageable in a way it actually wasn't. But she was here. She was still standing. She had come to a town with nothing and found the thing that nothing sometimes cleared the way for. The chance to build something with the exact materials you actually had, instead of the ones you'd been told to want. Dusty lifted his head suddenly and looked out at the south pasture with his ears up, and she followed his gaze, and there was nothing out there except cattle and grass and the hawk still working its thermal. Then she heard it, far off, barely audible, the sound of Pete's voice carrying across the flat land, saying something to Cal, and Cal's voice answering with what sounded like a question, and then Pete's voice again. She couldn't make out the words. She didn't need to. The ranch was going on. The ordinary work of it, the real continuous work that was the actual substance of any life. Not the dramatic moments, not the crisis and the courtroom and the midnight break-in, but the fence and the cattle and the water and the question Cal was asking Pete that Pete was patiently answering. That was the thing, she thought. That was the whole of it. You stayed, you worked, you kept what was worth keeping, and you let the rest go as best you could. And the people you stayed with, the ones who showed up at the right-wrong moment and turned out to be the kind of people who meant what they said, those people became the foundation of everything you built next. She looked over at Talon. He was looking at the valley, comfortable in the quiet, which had always been his way. "Tomorrow," she said, "we need to look at the creek pasture rotation. The east herd's been on the same section 3 weeks." "I know," he said, "and the water tank on the south side has a gap in the insulation lining that needs fixing." He glanced at her, just slightly. "Does it?" She kept her face even. "It does. I noticed it a while back. I'll have Cal look at it in the morning," he said. The sun was going down over the ridge to the west. It wasn't particularly beautiful, the way sunsets in novels were beautiful. It was hazy with dust, and the clouds were the wrong shape, and the light was more orange than gold. But it was real, which was better. Elara, Talon, and Dusty sat on the porch of the Mercer Ranch as the day ended, and behind them was a house that was half her home now, and in front of them was a valley that was half her land, and the day that had held more than any day had a right to hold was finally, at last, going quiet. She wasn't starting over. She'd never believed in starting over. You didn't start over. You carried what you'd learned and what you'd lost and what you'd managed to hold on to, and you moved forward with all of it. And gradually the weight of the past stopped being what pulled you down and started being what held you steady. That was the best you could do. That was, she'd come to believe, enough. Dusty exhaled the long, settling sigh of a dog fully at peace with his circumstances, and the valley darkened, and the day was done.